Hello and welcome to yet another CNBC Africa Special. On this particular edition, we are looking at the youth, the next age of entrepreneurs. Of course, we are at the Youth Connect Africa 2018, where much of the conversations were going around how to create or connect youth for a continental transformation. Now, joining me today, of course, is Lawrence Mori, who is the Commonwealth Secretariat Programs Officer for Youth Division. And of course, we'll be joined by Nicola Grace Hove from Uhuru Mining, and she is actually a World Economic Forum Global Sherpa. Now, to my extreme, of course, rather to my immediate left is Shamaki Abdullahi, who is the Program Management Officer at UN Habitat. Thank you very much for getting time to speak to us.
Thank you for having us.
I do believe that this is rather going to be a very interesting conversation, but as we kick it off, of course, we're seeing a lot of trends happening in Africa and in the global market about job unemployment, job creation, and all of this. We know that for Africa to stand out, we're looking at 74 million jobs to be created by 2020. So far, we need about 52 more jobs that need to be created. Who is going to create this? Of course, the entrepreneurs. But now my question is, how do we change the mindset of the youth in Africa to look at entrepreneurship first other than employment? I think I'll start with the entrepreneur in the midst, Grace.
Thank you so much, Michael. When you talk about the issue of mindset change should not only be a burden of us, the young people, in terms of transforming the way we approach opportunities and therefore create entrepreneurship opportunities for ourselves. It should start with the education system itself. When I started high school, primary school, there was no way I was taught to think about creating jobs in my adult life. These are things we're now discussing and learning, trying to learn the ropes as we are adults now, coming together with the rest of the world. This is a topical issue. Sad enough, we had an education system that was created that failed to really see what the jobs of the future will require. And I'm glad we've started this conversation, but more importantly, mindset change should start with policy making. How do we frame and review the current education system in our countries, right from preschool to primary school to high school to college? There is a huge influx of graduates that are seeking employment, and I feel we are at a point where we can say we have a crisis, and we need agency, we need speed we need to immediately act so that we address the challenge of unemployment. Mindset change when it comes to us entrepreneurs, for me, the key is industrialization. There is no other better answer. We need to start learning also how to industrialize in Africa. We have a lot of raw materials. Think about an agriculture, think about our mineral wealth, think about us as the people, the raw material, the human capital of Africa. How do we start seeing that as opportunities to create jobs, to monetize and develop our continent? So it's how I'm glad we're already starting these conversations. This is evidence of mindset change. We're seeing it, the need, we're addressing the need by constantly engaging in dialogue, but we need to constantly immediately move to action.
Gentlemen, of course, Grace is bringing something on the table that is rather very interesting, something to do with the education system. I'll start with Lawrence, and I'll come back to you, Shama, just 1 second. Do you see a need, an urgent need for Africa to actually revise the education system as a whole?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. I think that's a very critical question. Has been going on for quite a number of years, decades, if I must say. And I think the hugest challenge with the education system is that you've had teachers who are used to train students with a certain pedagogy and curriculum that has been known for over years. So when we start thinking about education curriculum change, it's a holistic thing that needs to actually be looked at. If we don't start training teachers on new ways of teaching, on new ways of engaging students, then first of all, the people who are exchanging that, or rather sharing that knowledge with the future of the economy, which is the human resource capital of Africa, I think we are going to miss out. But then also, another complex thing with the education change is also, I mean, we can't wake up and just change curriculum and systems. As much as the urgent need is there, I think there needs to be a much more holistic look at what are the problems of the next 20, 30 years going to be. They're probably not going to be the same ones we're looking at and concerned about now. And that thinking about skilling tomorrow's economy is a fundamental one that would help us get to think about the social media disruption of the normal ways of doing business nowadays, the artificial intelligence, and things that are actually, shaping tomorrow's globalization. But I would say that while education change in of itself is good, it's better to then look at what we are educating our new generations for, looking at what the needs will be in the future. We are very much concentrating on now, and then that holistic approach is not being given to the actual, problems that will come in the future. So by the time we are getting to the future, we'll again be talking about, education change then. While if we thought about now, 50 years to come, and I'm glad, we have enough frameworks, the Agenda 2063, that we have a lot of policies and frameworks that exist, but then we're not embedding that within education, political, social, and cultural systems, which then shape the enabling environment to actually change attitudes, mindsets of the people that we're actually, training.
Lawrence, when you talk about changing the education system right now, brings me to a conversation that happened in Davos at the World Economic Forum, of course, where Jack Ma, who leads Alibaba Group, he mentioned that we need to change right now, and not just with the education system, but which kind of skills we're bringing to the market. And I want to draw my attention to Shamaki. Shamaki, we, of course, are definitely looking at China, of course, where Alibaba and a lot more other companies, big companies, tech companies are actually setting up shop right now. What do you see that Chinese actually did different to see growth on their small enterprises? Because if you talk China right now, they will tell you Apple is made in China, everything else is made in China.
No, thank you, and thanks for bringing me on this show, and I'm happy and honored to be here with my colleagues. And this has been a phenomenal exchange of ideas and young people the last few days. So I think to have this discussion in Kigali is certainly inspiring, and I think you've set the bar in terms of youth excellence and really having a conversation that's open, honest, and hope we can get into this with this panel. But to get to your question, I think it's an important question, and China has done a lot of things differently. I think China has been extremely ambitious with their their roadmap, the Silk Road ambition that they have in terms of investing in infrastructure. But the biggest investment that China made, and you're seeing the benefits of these results now, is 10, 20 years ago, where I think Africa should be thinking about and doing now, which is investment in young people to prepare them for jobs of the future. Now, yes, the education system is a challenge, and starting younger and making sure that our policies are holistic and cover the broad range of government, not just within education sector, but the entire national development plan. But one thing that I keep seeing consistently over and over again is when young people that transition between formal education, whether it's university, college, and getting into the labor market. And there are two key gaps that I often see is a huge skills mismatch, but also the soft and transferable skills. There are certain skills like budgeting you're never really taught in school. So when you enter a labor market and you have your first job, the relationship that young people have with money is different. It's new for the first time. They have huge amounts of money, or not lack of money, and don't know how to invest some of that capital. So the transferable skills that we need once young people graduate, the skills that they're not picking up in formal education, is a huge gap that I see. So investing in young people early age, investing, I think, in infrastructure, which Kigali, again, a good example of what they've done. I think in Africa, huge infrastructure investment could open up job opportunities for young people. And I see this as an opportunity, and I see the way to innovate this is through the tech sector. So you've made an argument for tech being a huge opportunity in China, but I think instead of talking about Silicon Valley, I think we need to change the narrative in Africa and talk about Silicon Savannah. And how do we change that mindset and bring these new ideas to bring tech sector to here? I think last year you had Jack Ma here, you had Mark Zuckerberg in Nairobi. Yeah, Akon was here last year as well. And I think the more exposure of tech companies from different parts of the world to places of Africa, and I think as seeing Africa as a meaningful and a labor force that is skilled. And I think that's the onus that should be on governments, is how can you prepare your future leaders to make sure when big tech companies come here, that you're offering them the right skills. I think one of the drawbacks of China's huge presence in Africa is that they're not employing enough Africans. That Africans who are in the labor force when China is here is often remedial or low-skilled jobs. They're not in the tech sector. So how can we really reinvest in the skill building? How can we reinvest in the soft and transferable skills when young people have the formal education to make a meaningful impact when they're in the labor market?
Definitely. Now, let's move on to Grace again. Allow me to take this next question to you. Of course, are you seeing enough tax breaks in your particular sector in the country where you're from that actually you would say is creating a little bit of a breathing space for entrepreneurs? And how can we actually harness this on the continent?
You know, our situation is slightly different. When you talk about Zimbabwe, we are a nation that is currently reviewing a lot of things. We're going through a transformative stage that could potentially see such incentives being given, especially to young entrepreneurs. The biggest challenge we've had so far is the economy was in dire stress. There were several impediments to the success of not only entrepreneurs, but even foreign investors were coming into the country. Recently, the new Minister of Finance made an announcement on and reviewed a couple of policies around tax, around the currency we use. You know, we're a multi-currency state that was trying to reintroduce our own currency. So I would like to hold on and say, from my country, we would require a bit more time because most of those things are really under review. We haven't really been performing as expected of other economies around Africa. You look at the fact that we recently made reviews to the indigenization policy. That was a few months ago, and the whole world is excited. So in terms of tax breaks, I think it gives Zimbabwe a bit more time. We may see a bit more transformation that may be more favorable to us entrepreneurs, even foreign the businesses that are quite interested in coming into the country. Of course, change will take time. Change will take time. Everyone is holding their gut and trying to really project what may happen in the future, make one or two projections, but only time will tell. All we have right now is hope that there may be reviews that will be favorable, especially to the small to medium enterprises sector.
Your take on this, gentlemen?
I think I would very much agree with what Nicola is mentioning. I think the whole idea and aspiration, for Africa, we need to be a bit careful about ambition and delivery, and that's part of the backlog we've had with a myriad of policies and frameworks that then are not followed by the requisite human resourcing, the actual investment, the actual financing, and the diversification of the opportunities we have to valorize all the resources that we have. I mean, for me, I would say, I think starting off, looking at, the intellectual pool of human resource capital we have, in terms of the rhetoric around the demographic bonus we have, the 70% being young people under the age of 29 and so on, I think we need to creatively think on how we actually, first of all, within national development plans, have youth-centric budgeting processes. And that means then allocating requisite resources from the public sector into actual, youth-targeted, inclusive development outcomes that then address the issues of young people. But then also on top of that, I think we've talked a lot about the private-public partnerships for a while, and there are, examples that are, quite exemplary. But I think it's high time we start looking at the philanthropists and venture capitalists and people who are, within innovative financing mechanisms that then can tap into areas that the public sector would not necessarily invest in. And I think coming earlier actually to the question around mindsets, I think for me, we do have the creativity and the innovation within, the frameworks that young people have and they're exposed to as limited as they are. I think the cushioning of the risk of entering into entrepreneurship is something that is not really being addressed. So from legal redresses to actually just, the returns on investments, the bureaucratic measures that young people have to go through to open a business, to run a business, to make, young people won't get into business when they see all of this. So that enabling environment needs a bit more investment, time, and also just discussions with young people so that we contextualize what policies and plans are being made to create the environment better for them.
Maybe if I should take from what you just said and what Grace has just said, Grace mentioned that, of course, we need to see these reviews happening and a bit of a change or a shift in the paradigm, but it could take a lot more time than we expect, and we don't need to take a whole lot of time because we don't have that time. But let me jump to Shama. Shama, of course, we do know that the informal sector and entrepreneurs go hand in hand. Of course, if we're looking at economic development for Africa, we do know that SMEs create up to 70% of the jobs in the formal sector. The informal sector, of course, if you look at the likes of Rwanda, employing about 70% of the country, should we give enough tax breaks or even more breathing space for these to actualize? And we'll take a break after that.
I just want to pick up on Lawrence's.
All right, let's go.
Quickly. I think he raised something really important, and we talk about this now in terms of gender-sensitive budgeting, but also youth-sensitive budgeting, and it's important that we don't see these in isolation. So yes, they might sit in a certain department, they might sit in a certain ministry, but can we think about it as holistic and making sure that the entire government is quite serious about when we talk about gender and youth? Defense often in most countries is the biggest budget. Can we challenge governments to think outside the box and to say, as much investment as you're making in defense, can you also do that in gender and youth and make sure that is equivalent? I think that would send quite a strong signal to encourage more young entrepreneurs, to encourage more young startups. But to get to your question around, the informal sector, and I totally agree with you, one of the most unique things I think about Africa is how can we think outside the box in terms of creating incentives for the informal sector to be really a part of the formal sector and the formal society. So I totally agree with you. I think we need to think outside the box in terms of how we think of their participation. And the world is moving. Just some quick stats. So last year, in terms of crowdsourced funding alone in 2017, so pooling of resources and coming up with ideas, whether it's to innovate the informal sector or to pump more money into the informal sector. In the US alone, it's $3 billion, almost $3 billion in terms of crowdsourced funding. So when you look at the stats of huge crowdsourced funding platforms, the gap is in Africa. You look at stats and you find the stats in Asia, you find the stats in Middle East, you find the stats in North America, but there's a huge gap. You don't find stats in Africa. And I think this could be a huge platform and an opportunity for entrepreneurs, for many people in the informal sector. And you think of holistically, you think of old African proverbs, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And here's a village actually putting the resources and money towards, generating the economy. And I think as Africans and I think as young people working on the continent, working globally, we need to think a bit more on using what I think is new power and the new way of participation or mass participation to also spark the informal sector or spark young entrepreneurship.
Okay, let's us take a quick break. When we return, we'll look at the government incentives. Where are they, and are they in favor of small and medium enterprises on the continent? Stay tuned. Welcome back to this CNBC Africa Spatial Report with me, Michael Mjisha. On this particular one, we're looking at the next age of entrepreneurs on the continent. Of course, we know Africa has to create about 74 million jobs by 2020, and we're looking at 52 more to be created. How are these going to be put in place? We are trying to assess into this conversation to see how exactly this is going to happen. Of course, my guests tonight are Lawrence Muli, and we have Grace Hove and Shamaki Abdullahi. Thank you very much for creating time to speak to us, gentlemen. Of course, allow me to jump into that question that we left off with before we went to the break. Where are the government incentives going? And you might be asking yourself, why am I asking this question? We're looking at most of them going for the special economic zones. We know that Rwanda has one, we know the one in Djibouti, and a lot more spread across the continent, but these are mostly in favor for foreign investors coming into the country. Where are our SMEs left out at?
Right, that's a very interesting question, because we ask ourselves the same questions. How much effort is government doing to similarly build confidence in investor confidence and in us, the locals, the indigenous people's confidence? If you look at the trend that has gone on, there's a lot of public relations that goes on in trying to create a facade that Africa is open for business, opportunities are available for foreign investors. But at the same time, when you talk about the issue of incentives, we need to see equally the same effort being developed towards developing the SME sector. If you look at in Africa, the SME sector is still information. Talk about the issue of the statistics. There's still also not so many statistics that we can really stand on and bench and back up when it comes to the SME sector. I'll give an example of my country in Zimbabwe. Some reports will claim that unemployment is over 90%. Government has a different statistic. So in terms of how they really plan and prepare themselves in addressing the challenges we face as the small to medium enterprises sector, it says a lot about how they really view the issues. It would be great to really see thorough work being done, ground up, to really also see how we can fit in. When we talk about special economic zones, I know in my country of late we have been having dialogues with young people trying to see how we can fit in the whole matrix of special economic zones. And of course, most of this is questions. The very fact that we need to question where we fit in says a lot about the fact that we're not really, in terms of the grand vision, we are not strategically positioned for some of these opportunities. Now this requires us to then try and find our space, which is a necessary effort. Government is supposed to first serve its people before it creates the good impression to the investors that countries are open for business. So we really quite love to see equally the same effort being put, especially with the emerging small to medium enterprises sector in Africa by governments all over Africa. I know some countries have done very well. I'll talk about an example in South Africa, where government is really intentional about availing facilities for young people in the tech space. The innovators have facilities and great support from the government. Young people in various sectors have access to funding. Deliberate efforts by government to make sure that young people are also within the metrics of economic development. So such trends can be emulated. It's high time we start learning from each other as Africans instead of trying to take blueprints that have worked. Of course, blueprints are good. They project the potential we could explore, but it's high time we start looking at other countries that are doing well in Africa. African leaders, it would be nice to start seeing them having conversations about real issues that affect us beyond just the politics and the politics of coming to summits, gathering, looking good, taking pictures, and leaving such pertinent issues unaddressed.
Of course, Lawrence, you're the head of the department or the division for youth at the Commonwealth, and these conversations do come in because we're looking mostly at these small and medium enterprises being led by the young Africans. Yeah. So, give me your take on this particular conversation. Where are the incentives?
Thank you very much. And I'm not the head of the U division. I'm a program officer within the U division. But just before answering your question, I think I want to pick up from what Grace mentioned earlier, on the whole point around statistics and the importance of data and evidence-based policy making and programming. I think that's a huge element that is lacking within the way we formulate policies across all, socioeconomic sectors of development at a government level. And that's part of the reason why, as a Commonwealth, we launched what is called the Global Youth Development Index, which is a composite index that looks at the progress of youth development across 5 domains with around 18 indicators. And we created a ranking. So as a composite index, there is actually a ranking, a score that uses the HDI methodology. But the essence of the ranking was actually intentional. One, to spark the discussions and debate about the importance of data, but also just to challenge governments for them to see that this is how bad you are doing on these domains of youth development, and yet we have the rhetoric about young people are the future leaders and they are our demographic dividend that we need to tap into. And I think a key thing that we need to see beyond the incentives, I think, is we need to ensure that we are engaging with government, first of all, in the policy formulation, just to ensure that there is context to, the policies that are being made, from the formulation to the ideas to the implementation, the monitoring and evaluation. And that, ecosystem approach to policy making is quite instrumental in ensuring that when the incentives are coming, they're actually coming and meeting, the actual needs, broadening the, opportunity base for a lot of young people. But I think there are some good efforts that have been made. I mean, there's countries that have affirmative actions on securing like contracts that are only, for young people, for young women, for people living with disabilities. Kenya, for example, has a whole 30%, procurement of all government tenders need to go to actual, young people and young women and people living with disabilities. But if you look deeper into a lot of these affirmative actions, the challenge is not in the policy framework. The challenge is in nitty-gritty issues that are not being addressed. For example, a lot of the young people who had a lot of this, benefited from a lot of these affirmative actions, either businesses fail, or they're not able to have returns on investments, or they're not even able to have bankable proposals because they don't have the financial literacy to actually, do the correct, way in which you can actually get a proposal that can actually be invested in and, get money for your business. But also, even on top of that, it's just the bureaucratic measures that young people have to go through to access some of this, opportunities that are out there. So, for example, a key deficiency that was seen is there's a requirement, for example, for you to have had tax returns for 3 years to be able to actually, access some of these opportunities. And you ask yourself, where will a young person who's starting out as an entrepreneur have tax returns for 3 years? But also, deeper into that is that there's again no knowledge that, for example, you can buy equity into dormant companies and partner with other people to be able to leverage that requirement, then be able to have a bankable proposal. So I think those areas of capacity building and training for young people to access this, incentives that are out there is a key element to ensure that young people are actually, leveraging the opportunities that are out there.
Lawrence, I'd like to tap into that because you mentioned Kenya, and I remember just the latest news coming out of the country suggests that 3 of the top Kenyan banks are among the top 20 banks in the world that are actually faring well. But of course, we saw a decline, of course, in the profit making in the entire banking sector in East Africa. And we saw that hurting a lot of small banks and SMEs, mostly because they were not necessarily getting financement for their projects. And this is coming to Shamaki. So tell me, when will we look at, say, doing away with collateral? We've seen Silicon Valley actually spearheading this and doing quite well with it. So when should we see Africa doing away with collateral when it's going towards small and medium enterprises and startup companies?
So before I get to your question, I really like the conversation around here around data. So I just want to chime in a bit. I can't stress as well the importance of data and the importance of collecting that information, because I think the other thing that we need to really think about and be mindful about is how do we attract more young people to the small and medium-sized or the informal sector. I think there's this notion that when you start a company, you want to be a billionaire. You want to, you see the glitz and glory, but the process in between is not really thought through, and that's what Lawrence was kind of alluding to in terms of making sure that the financial budgeting skills, the proposal support, and all that stuff is important. And I think mapping, just a basic mapping exercise around what jobs are available in the informal sector and where are the gaps where young people can actually make meaningful contributions to start their own businesses in the informal sector would be great and huge. And I think at UN Habitat, one of the things that we've been doing, we have an urban, we have a slum upgrading unit that really tackles that question in urban slums across multiple countries in Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. And they've been mapping that out for a while. But to get to your question around investments and looking at creative ways at UN Habitat, again, the youth unit since 2009 has been giving small and medium investments, 25,000 to about 10,000, ranging in between that rough estimate area, to really empower young people in terms of making sure that there is support throughout the transition. We have capacity building. We have financial budgeting skills. We're also partnering them and connecting them with mentors to make sure that they're mentored throughout the process. And we're not just giving them this money and saying, okay, be gone, you have your investment, now go do what you need. There's an entire coaching process for a year. But I think I was alluding to earlier, we need to think creatively in how we harness the huge participation that we have of young people who might not have a lot of money, but could figure out a way to pool different resources and attract investors to Africa and investors to the continent. I've been blown away by honestly some of the creativity that I see in Nairobi, some of the creativity that I've met and young people that I've met here at Kigali and what they're doing. And to be honest, their proposals, and when you sit down and have a conversation with them, every detail is thought through. And sometimes the gap is that investment piece. And I think there's a huge opportunity in figuring out how you can pool resources to figure out how do you get to your end? How can you look at fundraising? And I'm sure you face this as well. When you're a young person and you don't have that capital, one of the biggest things, there's a young woman who was talking to me yesterday. She had a brilliant idea. We had coffee afterwards. And I was just like, just do it. The investors will come. If your idea is results oriented, if you can show what you're trying to do and the impact that you're creating, it'll come. It'll come. So continue to just do it, figure out what you want to do, be determined. And there is nothing wrong with failing. Honestly, a lot of the youth, urban youth fund projects that we funded, a lot of those youth, their business ideas did not succeed. They weren't able to invest more capital. And I think there's nothing wrong with failing. And to be honest, one thing that I would like to see here next year is instead of talking about all these young people who've been extremely successful, and I think it's great, the mentoring and showing people that it's possible, but why don't we hold a session that looks at a fail fest? Why don't young people who have tried businesses, who've actually failed and learned something from this experience, share some of these experiences as opposed to just putting on a podium young people who have done it. But we don't talk about that story and that process and that transition and how many times that young person who is here now has failed. And I think there's more to learn from these experiences and these shared conversations around what was that process like? How did you navigate that? What did you do? How did you think creatively around the financial issue? How did you think creatively about government taxes that were extremely hard? How did you think creatively about a non-supportive group of people that you were around? What did you learn? There's so many things to learn from failing, and I think these are honest conversations that we need to have a bit more. And I think the focus now is on huge young people who have succeeded, but we don't talk about we don't unpeel some of the layers of the onion.
Grace, Lawrence, any of your take on this?
I'd like to just build on something that is very important that is mentioning. It's in the detail. Half the time, you asked the question on the issue of collateral. We are seeing a culture of banks also. I think banks in Africa are getting also exposed to the new ways of investing without collateral as seen in other continents, in China, in the USA, Silicon Valley, and what have you. And I think it's high time they start learning and realizing that collateral is an impediment. I've had several conversations, and I think they become tautological. We keep going in circles and circles. We sit down with financiers, the banks come, and I feel they're not learning. They're not living in the times. Times have changed. If we are to sustainably support young people, let's have realistic expectations and also start learning and tapping into the experiences of some financiers all over the world, venture capitalists. Where do they get their confidence? It's an issue of confidence. I've seen bank CEOs arguing that we are also in the business of making money. People should not forget that we need that security, we need that assurance. But it continues to serve an impediment. And something Lawrence touched on the issue of the fact that it's in the detail. We need also, it's our responsibility as young entrepreneurs to start learning about the right ways of doing business. I'll tell you something. No matter how much business school you learn, you go to the best business schools in the world, the amount of soft skills you develop, you constantly need to re-engage with people and constantly keep abreast with new ways of doing business. And I think as young people, there's quite a focus, an unnecessary obsession with saying, we're not getting the support we want, we're not getting this and this. And it's important we start talking about the fact that the real truth, the hard truths. How many of us were taught how to develop some of those plans? How many of us know how to develop bankable projects, proposals that can actually sell? Remember, it's not about us, young people, constantly making noise about the fact that we're not getting finance, we're not getting the support. It's business. It's supposed to be a win-win situation, and we need to do our part in developing the soft skills to network. I was just having a conversation earlier on before this with someone talking about the fact that networking is too broad. People say you come here to conferences, you network, but has anyone really unpegged what networking means? Is it about just receiving business cards of top CEOs and big people? I get Lawrence's business card, I get yours, I link up with you, take yourself. Is that enough? How do I learn to monetize from my relationships? And these are things we need to start learning now. These are things that are not taught in schools. And for me, if we do not master that, we'll continue having nice fancy conferences where we talk about the same issues and we don't address the real issues. And the young people, I'll say this too, for my colleagues, the attitude, the entitlement attitude needs to stop. It's a win-win situation. If someone has capital and they're sitting across the table, it's your responsibility to do due diligence. How do you put together a bankable proposal that sells? It's not just about knowing how to put a proposal together. Which are the other resources are you tapping to? Which other people are helping you to develop bankable proposals that can actually sell? Are you really abreast with new ways of doing business? Because it's constantly evolving. And the sad thing is that the things are moving very fast. And if you have that sense of entitlement, you deprive yourself of so many opportunities. Yet if you give yourself time to learn and master and stay on your toes and understand that the world is really moving at a fast scale, you could definitely find yourself in a different
Thank
position.
you, Grace. Maybe let's move on to Lawrence for just a bit. A quick one. Lawrence, of course, as you mentioned venture capitalism, and it's very interesting because when we look at the likes of Silicon Valley, they have all sorts of venture capitalists. They don't necessarily need to go to the bank and have collateral to start a business or a startup. Tell me, should governments in Africa start focusing on venture capital funds?
I think it's not a yes or no. I think the enabling environment to create, the opportunity for young people to access finance and valorize the whole value chain on every single opportunity on each business is something that is holistic. So there is the role of innovative financing models, venture capitalist funds, philanthropies to come into the private public partnerships that are supporting SMEs, especially in Africa. But I also think that, young people pay taxes. So there is a role of the state to ensure that, there is requisite allocation of financing to, youth-led and youth enterprises. And a lot is happening. I think it's just that we have missed the ecosystem approach in addressing SMEs development. So while if you take the agri sector, for example, it's taken us quite a while to get to this point where we are talking more about agribusiness, talking about the whole value chain of the agricultural sector, from to transport to labor market research to communications to logistics and so when a young person is thinking about agriculture, then they're not just thinking about the planting and the harvesting, and there is a whole ecosystem, and that is where investment needs to go, so that we structure, we institutionalize, we systemize the sectors, and that way we are creating and broadening opportunities for more young people, as opposed to just looking at a sector and investing in giving funds and expecting results out of it. So I think, again, the private sector will be incentivized when they also, and that's why I agree with what Grace was mentioning, where everybody's in the business of making business, and the bigger question is, what's the return on investment? And that's why, coming now to the young people themselves, I think for me it's always a challenge when I meet young, very enthusiastic young people. There is better ways to engage, and these ad hoc tokenistic ways of engagement where you come and you rhetorically just repeat what was done before needs to really stop. High time young people invest in research, in data. It was so sad, for example, hearing some comments and some questions. We'll actually talk about this later yesterday, where these are the elite. The young people who are in this forum are actually the 10% who have access to these spaces, and hearing that somebody who's asking about ease of doing business, cost of doing business, how costly it is to move around, yet we have the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which young people should know about. Then look at what areas they can actually strengthen, where the gaps are, where the value propositions are. And this whole entitlement, as was being said, needs to really stop. Young people need to earn the right to be heard. And that means you need to know what the vision has been set up by the public sector or government, and then look at the gaps that exist, and then create a value proposition for that. Politicians and government will come running after things that add value to what they already have.
Lawrence, maybe before we wrap this whole conversation up, and you've brought up something interesting again, of course you're speaking about policy makers mostly. Now we're looking at a digital drive that is taking a space in Africa. Of course we're looking at the healthcare going digital, we're looking at agriculture going digital. Pretty much everything that was, informal maybe back in the day, like the agriculture sector today. You're looking at robotics going into the agriculture sector. But my question really comes to be, how do we incentivize digital enterprises when the policymakers are actually old-timers? I'll take it from that side, going here.
Thank you. Very good question. I think, first of all, even before addressing how to ensure that we are addressing
digital accessibility and so on, digital hegemony is a reality in Africa. We have around 9-11% penetration of the internet in the continent, and so, for example, we need to first of all just know where we are and know where investments need to go in terms of expanding ICT and access to internet, because if we then digitize so fast, which we need to and we have to keep up with the global trends and so on, we just need to ensure that the principle of leaving no one behind is quite critical. So if you just get out of a lot of the capital cities in many cities in Africa, there's no even phone connections, electricity, and these are people who are actually facing the brunt of existential threats to climate change, to marginalization, to rights issues, and even the very access to basic resources are not there. So I think the conversation needs to ensure that it's holistic and carrying forward especially marginalized and disenfranchised communities that are not necessarily within the urban areas, which is where a lot of the investments and a lot of the digitalization is actually taking place. But then also on top of that, I think there is also now a much broader opportunity to then ensure that there's non-state actor engagement in this whole digital journeys. So we need to then decentralize development from just urban centers. And that's part of the reason why we will, be always talking about rural to urban migration, because if we have tracts of land that are out there, that are outside of the cities, why not then, use those opportunities and spaces to then create the digital hubs, to then create the opportunities that, young people get to know that I don't need to go to the city to then have access and opportunity. I can actually valorize the opportunities I have in the rural area. I think that's a key element that will help us move together as we digitize.
Grace?
Right. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. I feel in Africa, we have a great deal of work to do in terms of really unpacking that in our context. because in as much as it is good to say all the fancy things about leapfrogging technology and what have you, the biggest challenge, like Lawrence has already reiterated, is the fact that infrastructure is still a concern in most African communities. How do you talk about leapfrogging when we still have a huge amount of people living in darkness? Water is still an issue. Accessing basic things like water, electricity, internet for all is still an issue. The cost of data in Africa is still ridiculous. I feel that we are somewhat being exploited by some of these companies because we're still excited. We jump over the fact that it's data, we're able to stay connected. But if you look at the rest of the world, I was shocked the other time I visited family abroad, and I was shocked. Internet is almost free in certain public spaces. And here we are in Africa still trying to get a person to really connect. They excite themselves over these. But also to your question, governments need to act fast. Speed, I think we require speed in terms of the role of government in really understanding the requirements of today. I recently read an article about a recent innovation, German innovation, that is going to replace jobs in mining ridiculously. It's going to be a shocker. It's a huge machine that will literally do away with over 1,500 jobs in mining. Are we ready for that? What are we doing in the African context? We're getting our innovations mostly from China. Who is sitting down with Chinese to ensure that they also, beyond just shipping stuff into Africa, equipment into Africa, it really serves our needs as Africans? The problem is we're too much of consumers and we don't really play our part. I worry at times about the people who sit down in the role of government and negotiate some of those transactions under the title public-private partnerships on our behalf as citizens of certain countries all over Africa. I worry about the fact that do they really have a good grasp and understanding of the times we live in? Do they really know how fast the world is moving? Because it's sad to hear. One point I read an article about how government got equipment from China and they discovered they were actually snow graders. They were actually supposed to be plows, but then they discovered they'd actually gotten snow graders. Where is snow in Southern Africa? There's no snow in Southern Africa. And the big question is, who is sitting down to structure some of those transactions on our behalf? Are we putting them, are we sitting down with them and making sure that they account and they take their job seriously? Because it's costly and time is moving and the world is moving. Fourth Industrial Revolution is massive. The world is talking about serious technologies that are going to change the world. We're talking about issues such as virtual reality. I know in Africa, I was sad to see children are still quite fascinated, but people already scales up, and I think we need a holistic approach from both governments, private sector, also foreign investors. We need to hold them to account and realize that it's not about them benefiting. Of course, it's business, but we need to also stand our ground in most of these negotiations.
All right, Shamaki.
My mind is, we've had lots of great conversations today, and it's kind of jumping back between the conversations. I just want to pick up on the previous question that you asked around the venture capitalists and the investment. And I think something that Lauren said really sparked a thought in me. And I think when the environment is not ripe enough for that type of investment, and you alluded to ecosystems and making sure that there is a holistic or an environment that's conducive to making sure that that type of investment is there, I don't think that's the solution. I don't think the copy and paste is going to work really well for this continent. I think what we need to be thinking about is how can we, number one, ripen the environment so that type of creative thinking is at least a bit more palatable to a government official who might not be aware of what this means or what the ramifications around this is, and come up with something content specific, that even country or city specific, that really works for the needs of each individual country within the continent. And to what Grace was saying, I couldn't agree with you more. When decision makers are at certain tables, how can we encourage them to think collectively as opposed to individually? And I think this is a huge criticism that comes back again and again. And I think it's about, again, not only building the capacity. I think the role of international NGOs of the Commonwealth is really how can we support governments and feed, number one, the statistics and data, the jobs of the future, and also sensitize them around digital movements or whatever space the job market is moving towards, or think of creatively around investments and opportunities. So I want to end my comments by saying, we need to be realistic, we need to be practical, but if the environment is not ripe enough for the ideas and the conversations that we're having, we'll continue to have the same conversations. So I think it's upon us, and it's every individual citizen should take the opportunity, number one, to educate themselves on some of the challenges and opportunities, and then figure out a way to feed this information into governments, right? And I think our role as citizens really is to make sure that our governments are well informed when they're going into these decision making. Some would argue that it's their own direct offices, but I think that's not working. So how can we gauge, again, mass participation and open up the process so people can feed these different innovative ideas to governments? And how can international NGOs, again, work side by side with governments to make sure that the best ideas or investments are coming into their country? And I think, lastly, the point around investing in young people, because the jobs of the future and what we're talking about, the digital gaps, how can we make sure that we're working closely with our educators? And I think before we even go to schools, the first educators that young people have as family, is in the family. So what is each of us as parents or, folks who have children, what's our main responsibility before that child is in school? And how can we ask the internal question ourselves, are we preparing our children rightly for the school? And how can we challenge our schools to push our children a bit further? And you're right, if we don't have internet or access, especially in the rural communities, we might not have that access. And I think this is the huge challenge with the content. I think basically, how do we get into information for all? How do we look at rural communities and make sure that everyone has access to internet?
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen and lady, of course, for joining us tonight and speaking about this particular conversation. Of course, a rather very interesting one, because we're looking at technology growing every day and new ways of doing business. How are young entrepreneurs in Africa catching up and coping with the new situations? You basically touched base with everything, so thank you very much for getting time. Of course, we were discussing this with Lawrence Murray, who is the Programs Officer for Youth Division at Commonwealth Secretariat, and of course, Nicola Grace Hove of Uhuru Mining and World Economic Forum Global Shaper. My other guest, of course, at my immediate left is Shamaki Abdullahi, who is the Program Management Officer at UN Habitat. Of course, much more will be definitely happening here at CNBC Africa, first in business worldwide. My name is Michael Mjisha. For more, you can tweet us at CNBC Africa or my personal handle at Galwero4.